Thank you for attending today's RDA webinar on RDA in the Digital Humanities. I am Katrin Beck from the RDA Europe Training Program team. Now let me present you our speaker. Bridget Almas is currently the lead software developer and architect for the Alpheios Project, developing open source tools for the study and enjoyment of classical languages. In her prior role at Tufts University, Bridget was the technical lead of the Perseids Project and before that the Perseids Digital Library. She has also acted in several leadership roles in the Research Data Alliance, serving as an elected member of the Technical Advisory Board from 2013 to 2015, and as co-chair of the Research Data Collections Working Group, the Data Fabric Interest Group, and as a liaison between the Alliance of Digital Humanities Organizations and RDA. Bridget also has a background in the study of foreign languages, including French and Mandarin Chinese. So let's start our webinar.
Thanks, Catherine. Hello, everyone. It's morning here. I just start by asking your patience because it's Monday morning after a long weekend. Maybe not the best time to give a webinar, but I'll do my best. To give you a bit more information about my own personal background and motivation for participating in RDA. I became a programmer while working in commercial software development. Before that, I studied languages. I did a variety of different jobs in different areas, but I became a programmer working in commercial software development. And I became engaged with RDA in 2013 while I was working for the Perseids Digital Library at Tufts University. Perseids was developed under the leadership of Gregory Crane and was one of the first big digital humanities projects. It currently serves thousands of users, millions of pages, both in and out of academia, and is really, I think, maybe one of the first research infrastructures in digital humanities. And so I came to Perseids funded by the Mellon Foundation's infamous Bamboo Project, which had attempted to develop a shared infrastructure for research data in the digital humanities. It was interesting to me because many of the same issues that are being raised through RDA today were the same issues we were confronted with and battling on that project. And I think in many ways it was a project that was way ahead of its time because we weren't ready to think about some of those issues. And so we lost that battle, but we learned a lot in the process. And so my next project at Tufts, the Perseids Project, was really born out of that effort where we tried to learn from some of those lessons of building shared infrastructure and focused on a much smaller shared infrastructure for humanities research and pedagogy in the subdomain of digital classics. And so it was in that context that I came to participate in RDA. And really I was motivated by the assumption that that any infrastructure for the sciences could well serve the needs of humanities. I was certain that the problems that we had were not specific to humanities. And I also wanted to be sure that if an organization such as RDA was defining the solutions for sharing research data, that the needs of the humanities would be considered so that I could take advantage of what came out of it. And so, the primary motivation was to avoid reinventing the wheel. And, I know it's a tired metaphor, but one of the reasons I really like this picture is that, all wheels are not identical. And there are nuances and differences between the needs of different domains, and even within domains. And that was what we learned, in the Bamboo Project, is that, just to say we're in the humanities, the digital humanities, doesn't mean that our needs are all exactly the same. But the real challenge is finding the things that are similar, so that we don't have to reinvent those, and that we can focus in our individual domains and our individual projects on enhancing and making better and making more specific to our needs the things that must be, while not reinventing that same circle of the wheel. And in doing so, we can improve on solutions not only for ourselves but shared solutions. And so that's really I think that it's not always bad to see that there are differences in things, but to really try to find the common infrastructure underneath. So what are some of those common needs that I've learned about through participating in RDA, and in some cases been given the language for thinking about? I think these are some of the things that we've been talking about within the community, and I think that they're all very apt. We have a need for persistent identifiers for our data, as well as services and standards for managing those identifiers. We have needs for collection management, managing our data in the context of collections, repositories for storing it, data registries and formalized data types for describing the data, metadata services, content services, services and standards around data provenance and reproducibility, search and indexing, peer review and workflow standards, brokers for transforming data between different sources and different formats. These are really, I think, the underpinnings of infrastructure that people are focusing on in the RDA community, and which really are the things that if you look at them are not so different between the different domains. These are very general pieces of infrastructure that we all need. And, in addition, we also have common needs for workflow tools. And this is where the differences begin to make themselves known. We have needs for curation of tools that allow us to curate our data, to annotate it, to perform analysis on it, to perform visualization and publication. And these things do differ across projects and across domains, but if on the prior slide, you see those are the services that are needed to feed into these tools to enable us to get our data in and out of them. And if we can not reinvent those things, then we can put more attention into refining these tools, which are where we touch the data and use it ourselves as humans. That's where we can really be focusing our effort, rather than each of us reinventing how we get our data in and out of such tools. And then the amount that we need to build of each of these tools in a differentiated way becomes smaller. So we can really focus on the fine points of what our needs are. And in addition to the tools and services that we have in common across domains, there's also challenges, right? We are all struggling with these challenges. How do we deal with shared governance if we're sharing tools and services? How do we make sure the things that we build and the data that we produce is sustainable, that is available much beyond any one of us individuals? And feeding into those challenges are these project-based funding models that we all work with in this community. We have a research project that we need to finish or need to accomplish. We get funding for that project. We build tools and services, produce data in the context of those projects. And when the funding ends, we are left trying to figure out how to maintain and sustain all that investment that we've put into it, as well as to make sure the results remain reproducible and available far beyond the individual projects. A final challenge that I think we all face is how to, especially if we want to build and produce things that can be shared, is how to take extensibility into account from the beginning and not focus so narrowly on our own individual use cases that we can't see how they apply, how what we're producing and building applies in other circumstances. So these are all, challenges that feed into each other. If we don't build something that's extensible, then we can't really sustain it. If we don't haven't thought through the governance models, we can't sustain or build something that serves somebody else besides our own needs. And the project-based funding models underlie all of that, with the pressure of, we have to produce something right now for this project, yet we want it to continue in the future. So this is sort of a circle of challenges that we're all dealing with. And it's not just specific to the humanities, it's across the entire academic research community. So identifying these problems doesn't necessarily mean that they automatically come with solutions, right? A lot of, what we do is to try to figure out how to get the value out of what we put in. And that, that's another trite metaphor, that you get out what you put in, but it's true. And, it's not always obvious how to get out what you put in. I like this picture, it's not as always, it's sometimes difficult to find those socks in the dryer, right? It's not obvious, but it is really, you have to put effort in order to get something out. And figuring out the best ways and the most efficient ways to put your effort in so that you get something out is often challenging. So I'll just tell you a little bit about the things that I have been doing and have done within the context of RDA to try to get out what I put in. I served as an elected member of the Technical Advisory Board from 2013 to 2015, and this was my participation in that was really driven by my initial motivation for becoming involved in RDA, which was to make sure that the needs of the humanities were considered in these solutions that people were talking about. And at the time, I thought participating in the Technical Advisory Board was the way to accomplish that. And I learned a tremendous amount about the organization and about other people's other domain problems while participating. It was early days of RDA, and so my original intention, which was to champion the needs of the humanities, probably, I learned that role on the Technical Advisory Board was maybe not the best way for me to do that. So then I, continued on and tried a few other things. One, I was also at the same time co-chair of the Research Data Provenance Interest Group, and that was an interest. One of the aspects of the project I was working on at the time I joined RDA was thinking about how to capture provenance for the data that we were producing on the Perseids platform. And so, this was an area of great interest of mine. I was not an expert in provenance by any means, but I wanted to make sure to be participating in that conversation. As that conversation evolved, it made sense to relinquish co-chairship of that group to people who were more expert in data provenance. And I felt that the Data Fabric Interest Group, which was really trying to put context around the outputs of RDA and the efforts of RDA for the membership within RDA, was an area in which I had something to contribute. And then finally, getting down to what I really needed out of RDA, which was I needed a solution for managing the data that we were producing on the Perseids platform. I decided to help co-chair the Research Data Collections Working Group, which was producing a solution, an API, and a data model for managing data and sharing data collections. And here, is where I, ultimately, most recently ended up in getting something out of RDA. My participation very concrete in that we came out of that working group is now finished. Its output is up for review by the community, but we came out of that with a very concrete solution for managing data collections that I was able to implement for my project. And so it was sort of an evolution for me to go from a very abstract role of, talking about humanities needs at the high level, participating in the advisory board and co-chairing some interest groups, to a very focused effort on putting my efforts into producing a concrete output. And underlying all of that, I did participate as a member of the RDA US Leadership Committee, which helped provide a local context for some of the work. So as I mentioned, what I have gained so far from participating in RDA certainly is the outcome of the working group that I just recently helped co-chair, but also a number of other things, right? This cross-domain perspective that I couldn't have focused just on my own problem, but really giving me having discussions and participating in plenaries and reviewing the outputs that were coming out of RDA gave me a way to think about some of the problems that we were trying to solve at Perseids and in the Perseids Project in a bigger context, thinking about, I want to identify my data. Oh, that is actually a general question of how to make data persistently identifiable, how to make sure, what I identify today can be retrieved under that identifier, and if it's different, how to formalize representing that information, how to formalize the data types that we're dealing with. All of these things, I had been thinking about in very specific terms of my project, but as I began to see the generalizability of the problems, it gave me a language to discuss them and to frame the problem I was having. And as I mentioned, specific solutions, such as the working group output that we produce, the collections API, but also the persistent identifier types API, the data types registry. These are solutions that I could actually take and apply to my problem. It also introduced new challenges, right? Once you open yourself up to thinking about your particular problem in a more general way, how it can be more extensible, then you begin to see new challenges that you need to address. So it's not always, it's not always immediately obvious that it's a good thing to have more challenges to address, but in the end, it improves the overall solution that you produce. And one of the things that I think can't really be understated is the value of having colleagues and collaborators within the RDA community. As I said, I came to work at Tufts from a commercial environment where I was used to working in bigger teams of developers and having a wide variety of colleagues and collaborators around, to working in a relatively small digital humanities project as the only developer. And I think certainly in the humanities, this is not an uncommon thing, that you have one or two developers working on a project, and you don't have a whole lot of colleagues and collaborators to bounce ideas off of, to consider solutions together with. And oftentimes those colleagues that you do have are competing colleagues, in that you're all competing for the same meager grant resources for your project. So you have an incentive to collaborate, but you also have disincentives from collaboration. And so one of the really valuable things that I've gained from the RDA community is having this set of colleagues and collaborators to share and talk about these problems with, to think about ideas, to think about solutions, and to collaborate with, where I'm not in a position necessarily to compete with them, but to just to share in the way that you would in a larger team. And it's certainly I have certainly gained so much from having that set of colleagues, and I think that it's not something that's easy to put a value on, or if you're talking to administrators and that sort of thing, to say why that matters. But if you're used to working alone and then you have an opportunity to work in a team, you can see immediately the benefit that brings. So what are, and I don't know, some of the people on this call maybe haven't yet participated in RDA or looking to understand why. So I wanted to outline some of the ways that you can participate, because there's a variety of different ways, right? You can adopt one of the outputs that are coming out of RDA. You can figure out how to apply it to your project or your problem. You can just come to the plenaries and participate in the community. We have plenaries every 6 months, and they're across the world, and sometimes they're not so easy to get to or so easy to fund. So it's not the only way to participate, but it is one very valuable way to put faces to names and to participate and view and listen to groups, meetings, that sort of thing that you just can't do remotely. you can remotely follow the discussions of the interest in working groups. You can subscribe to the mailing lists, and you can engage with members of those groups to put forth your needs and interests. And so you can either just follow along, or you can actually actively join an existing interest group or working group. It's a bit harder to join a working group that's already established because they're very focused on deliverables, but you can join as adopters or as use case providers. And I think most working groups welcome additional adopters and use case providers along the way. And you can start a working group of your own, and I think this is really important, that we can all consider doing project-based work within the context of a working group. If you have a problem that you need to solve for your particular data sharing, data management need, it's almost certain that somebody else in your domain, in another domain, has that same problem. And so in thinking about whether you're going to go and tackle that problem head on by yourself, or have collaborators to work on it with you and help you develop something that might last beyond your individual need, that's really one of the big values of doing it within a working group. And it's also a way to think about getting funding to participate. If you're going to go to a funder and say, fund me to develop this data sharing, data management solution, you can also consider asking for funding to do that specifically within the context of RDA. That's one of the things that I did, and I think it's what enabled me to put the amount of effort and time into the collections working group, because I had explicit support to do that. It takes a bit of, you have to be committed to doing that, but I think it's one model that works to enable, and this is one of the, as I've talked to other colleagues in the humanities, they don't have time or money to participate in RDA, but it's possible to find ways, if you think creatively about it, and think about how to take advantage of the structures of RDA to serve the needs of your project. So far, I've talked, much of what I've talked about is relatively abstract, and so I want to end with talking a little bit about some of the very concrete outputs of RDA and how they can apply in a humanities context. And that requires putting some pieces together, because we're not talking about turnkey solutions that work out of the box. We're talking about what we're doing here are producing the nuts and bolts that serve as connectors between things. So it's sometimes not necessarily immediately obvious how an output applies to your use case. And so that's what I wanted to walk through a bit, is how I've taken and applied some specific outputs of RDA to the work I did at Tufts. And I'll start with a sort of a overview that this is a concept and diagram that the source for this comes from Larry Lanham from CNRI and through work done in the Data Fabric Interest Group. But it provides sort of an overview context for what we're doing here, right? With data, we have end users, developers, and automated processes producing data. They deal with persistently identified, virtually aggregated digital objects, including collections, and those are themselves overlaid and used by multiple network services, which in turn feed into future information storage systems. I mean, this is at a very far level looking at the problem, but I think, but anybody who's working with data can recognize that this is essentially what we're doing, right? We have production of data, we want to identify it, we want to aggregate it, and we want to work with it in a variety of different ways, and then make sure it's stored. And so this concept really was very helpful to me in thinking about what we're doing at a very focused level, but seeing it from the big picture. And so to talk really specifically about our workflow, This is what the workflow that we needed to support was. We have a user who creates data, and it may go into one or more collections. In most domains, I think you have to think about the collections give you context for thinking about your data. You group it in different ways, and so we group our data as all of the data belonging to a specific user, but it might also be in a collection of all data about subject X or Y. And so then as the user goes through our workflow, they add it to a community which is responsible for providing peer review of that data. So now that same data object is sitting in a few different collections. It's in a user collection, it's in a subject collection, and it's in a community collection. And those are virtual aggregations of individual data objects. Then at the next stage, the user might request peer review, and at that point, it gets added to another collection of data, which is a particular review board for the community with which they interact. And at the last stage, when data passes peer review, it leaves the review board and goes back into a published collection. So this is the workflow that I was trying to support, and so there are all different ways these collections could be created. They could be dynamically created based on rules. They could be very, specific to individual users. But this is the general workflow that we're trying to support here. And so why we want to do this is we want to enable preservation and retrieval of all data in these different ways. We want to be able to say, give me all of the data created by user X, or community approved by community X, or of data of a specific type about a specific canonical resource. So very specifically in our needs, we want to be able to say, give me all tree bank data for Homer's Iliad, Book 1, lines 1 to 10, or all translation alignments of Homer's Iliad, Book 1, lines 1 through 10, or give me all semantic annotations on Virgil's Aeneid, Book 1. These are the types of queries that we want to be able to support for both use of the data as well as management and creation of the data. So these are some of the types of questions that we're trying to answer with our workflow. And so what does this mean? That means that we have data objects, and we have a need for data objects which can be persistently identified, consistently typed, so that we know the difference, say, between a morphosyntactic analysis of a word versus a translation alignment versus a semantic annotation. And we want that typing to be machine actionable, so that it doesn't require a human to interpret what is this piece of data, but rather it can be operated on by tools and services. And we want it to be possible to reproduce every individual piece of data that we produce on the platform. And that sometimes means a number of complex steps. A text that we work with must first go through tokenization and lemmatization before it can be annotated further. And those steps all need to be documented and ideally reproduced by machines in order to verify the accuracy of the data, or to just be able to understand the analysis that was done subsequently. The data objects also need to be able to be attributed to who produced them, both in terms of machines and individuals. And finally, cited. We want to be able to point at this particular analysis of data, or this particular data object itself, and cite it and say, this is what I'm talking about here. And so those are the things that we want to be able to accomplish with our data in our use case. And I'm realizing as I was looking through my slides before this that I didn't actually give you slides about the individual outputs that we are thinking about and have been working on applying here. But to just take a step back from it, those are, in this particular use case, there was the persistent identifier types API, which was about giving a consistent interface to creating, reading, and updating persistent identifiers of whatever type. And, we talk about handles as one type of persistent identifier, but there are also others that are used in the humanities. We use URNs. There are URLs that are used. And so we want, one of the things that the PID API was developed for was to give a consistent interface to reading persistent identifiers without necessarily dictating which system was used to persistently identify the data. The second output that I've represented here in this sequence is the Data Types Registry, which is a model for registering and typing your data. And this is, I think, a core component to making data machine actionable, because you need to be able to formalize what is that piece of data that I'm working with, and what not just in terms of MIME type, is it text or PDF or whatever it might be, but what is it conceptually. And then finally, the Collections API, which I mentioned before, which is an API and model for managing and sharing data in collections. So these outputs, you can find out more about the specifics of them on the RDA website, but these are the ones that I'm dealing with primarily here. And the way I see them supporting our use cases is this sequence diagram is one representation. So the user creates a data object on Perseids, and Perseids would perhaps query based on the properties that the user gives it into the Data Types Registry to find out what is the ID, the data type I should be working with, and then it will create an item for that data type. And then it might need to put it into a collection, so it would need to use the Collections API to filter for which collections are appropriate for this data. And there, it would probably pass in the data type identifier, access requirements. These things will vary depending on what collection we're working with, but certainly data type as identified by the Data Types Registry would be one component. And so then, after finding out from the Collections API which collections to work with, it may present the user with some options, and then it may need to do advanced querying on the collections, finding out, does an item of this type already exist? Does the collection allow me to add duplicates of data? Does it not? There's a variety of different things that might need to take into account there. So there are a number of different potential interactions with the Collections API. And then it may create an identifier. And in this case, we have you can see there's an interaction between the Collections API and the PID API, where the Collections API delegates to the PID API to create the persistent identifier. That could happen at a different stage too, but the point here is that these different outputs are interacting to support this workflow to give in the end the user a persistently identified data type, piece of data that has a formal data type and which belongs to one or more collections. And I think this is a very specific use case for Perseids, but I also think it's a general thing that pretty much we're doing in most all data management workflows, regardless of what our use case is. And so this is sort of the long-term vision that in the way in which I could see the RDA outputs applying for Perseids, in that, we have the workflow here is that a user is working with editing and annotating data. That platform might itself present a Collections API for consumers to find out what is available on the platform, and it would interact with institutional preservation repositories to perhaps assign persistent identifiers, but through use of the PID API would have a general interface, so that if under the covers that repository changed, or we wanted to deal with multiple repositories, the tools on the platform could write to a single API for managing the persistent identifiers. And in the center here is the Data Types Registry, where all players are reading and writing from that, which is sort of the, giving us a common machine actionable understanding of what the data is to begin with. So, this is sort of the long-term vision and why, I think these are some of the really important components to support our workflows. Whether or not these end up being the actual outputs that are in their current condition or their current format is less important for me than it is understanding what roles these outputs play in supporting the data management workflow. Thinking about knowing that I need to not have ad hoc definitions for the data that I'm working with, but something that's formalized that a machine can understand, and that I've put the thought into thinking about what are those properties of data that are important to express so that others can understand it. And so whether or not, for example, the Data Types Registry as the current implementation is available is what is the exact implementation that is used 5 years or 10 years from now is less important, I think, than the concept of understanding that we do need to register and our data in this way. And the same thing with persistent identifiers. So it's both we can use the concrete outputs that exist today, but also they help inform our thinking about how to manage the data to begin with. And that's really the value, one of the key values, I think, for me, the key takeaway values of these outputs is they help me think about how to manage my data in a way that not only I, as the producer and this tool developer, understand it, but that other consumers of the data that I haven't even thought about yet might be able to understand it. And so I'll just end with, I've now moved on from Tufts. I'm working on another project called the Alpheios Project. And this particular project crosses domains. It deals with pedagogy, linguistics, neuroscience, classics, computer science. And we will be collecting data that we want to share and reusing data from other sources and domains. So what I certainly expect and hope to make use of some of these same outputs, the collections API, for making the data that we produce available as collections that other people can reuse, and the concept of the Data Types Registry to make sure that as I create and store data that I'm doing it in a way that it can be shared, but also I intend and hope to be able to continue to take advantage of the RDA community to help me be aware of what else I need to take into account and to understand, especially as I deal with data across domains, what are the standards, services, metadata, all of those things. What do I need to know in order to use data from neuroscience to feed my questions of pedagogy and linguistics? And how can I produce data about pedagogy and linguistics that might be useful to the field of neuroscience? This is really what I think is so valuable about the RDA community is having all of those individuals across domains together, focused on a common problem, but bringing those individual perspectives. So I think in order to have time for questions, I am about done with my slides. So, at this point, I think we open up the field for questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Bridget, for your interesting talk. Do you have